moving right along in an incredibly efficient way, which is the way all journalists operate. My name is Deborah Blum. I'm director of the Night Science Journalism program here at MIT, and I'd like to invite my exceptional panel to come up. We have Lauren Feldman, who is a professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers School of Communication and Information. Bernadette Placky, who is the chief meteorologist and director of Climate Matters at Climate Central, and Anirudh, Tiwathia, who is the director of behavioral science at the Rare Center for Behavior and the Environment at an institution that I accidentally deleted from my statement. So if you would like to further introduce yourself, Anirudh, that would be great.
So I am Anirudh, and I'm a behavioral scientist who's working at the Entertainment Lab, which is a portion of RARE that focuses on climate and how it intersects with large-scale mass media entertainment and highlighting entertainment. So
we're going to be coming back to that in a very exciting way. Yeah. So let me start by saying this. This panel, which was organized by the wonderful Erin Kroll, was actually put together last year ahead of this election. And it originally had the title, Climate Change Communication in the Age of Decarbonization. So after the election, I tagged Erin and I said, you know, I don't think we can call it that. Our president has just been at Davos urging more coal plants. And so shouldn't we do a different title? So the title we have now, which you'll see in your program, is Climate Communication in the Post-Denial Age. And in our discussions of this, one of the things, and I'm going to come back to this, is whether that's actually an accurate title at all. Are we really living in a post-denial age? So to that end, I just want to run a few statistics by you. When we started talking about that, I went and looked and I thought, well, okay, if I go back to the 1990s, what does belief in climate change look like? And if I look at the Pew Center report from 1997, about 24% of all Americans argued that climate change was in fact a serious issue for the country. If we move it forward to 2023, it's 54% of all Americans. So clearly we've seen at least a doubling of belief in the United States on whether climate change is a real issue. However, if you parse those numbers a little bit more, you'll see that the reason we see that increase is because many, many, many people who are Democrat or Democrat-leaning believe in climate change. And if you pull it down to the GOP or people who are Republican-leaning, it's almost exactly the same as it was in 1997. It's 24%. So we've both moved forward and not moved forward at all in some really interesting ways. And that's one of the things I think we want to parse in this panel. And so I'm actually going to start on that note with Bernadette, because this was a discussion we had ahead of the panel, which is, why can't we say we're in a post-denial era if, in fact, we cannot?
Well, first of all, thanks for having us here. It's really great to be with everybody today. To me, the biggest misinformation when it comes to climate change has been sort of stepped upon already in some of these sessions, but it's thinking that people don't care about this. Because overwhelmingly, the data shows that people do understand the climate is changing. However, those numbers drop off about human causation, worry, and a lot of different layers. And all of this, and many of you know this already, but if you don't, Yale and George Mason University have done the Global Warming 6 Americas. They've taken this survey work twice a year going back to 2008. It is all packaged and downscaled in these beautiful maps across the United States, so you can really go in and with these 20-some questions, look at what people think about this issue. So this is where, as we started talking about this, I challenged the title. People do understand, and I go away from the word belief because I think it's an understanding of our changing climate. But we have a lot of work still on what that means and what can be done about it. So that's, to me, the level we have to get to.
Do either of you want to weigh in on that? If not, I'm actually going to ask a question that I hadn't planned to ask, but which occurred to me after listening to the panelists this morning, and that is this. We always hear, and we have had, in fact, heard for at least 8 years that the answer to resistance is for us to be more nice than anyone else. We go out. We're the scientific teddy bears in the community. We're likable, we're warm, we're fuzzy, we're respectful, we listen to everyone. And so, but has that actually changed anything? I would argue that, and I grew up in the American South, so I'm both related to and know a whole lot of people who don't think the way I do about climate change. They're not respectful. They're not particularly trying to be nice, but they are actually winning this in some interesting ways. So are we accomplishing anything? I'm going to ask all of you when we reach out to resistant audiences by trying to out-nice them and out-respect them and out-listen them.
Sure. Well, I think it's first really important to recognize how diverse our audiences are, right? And so I think some people are reachable and some people aren't. And
Right.
you know, if we turn to the Six Americas, one of the encouraging things that we've seen over time is the portion of Americans who fit into that denialist category has shrunk over time, and it's only about 10% of the population. We're not going to reach them, and I don't think it's productive to spend our time as communicators and researchers trying to devise ways to reach them. Then we have people in the middle who are maybe not engaged or aren't thinking about climate change readily or frequently, and maybe it's something like comedy, which I've also done a lot of research on, reaching people in unconventional ways, in unexpected ways where they're not looking for it. And then we have people who are concerned and even alarmed about climate change, but they're not doing anything about it. And so, I mean, this isn't exactly answering your question, but I still think it's important to parse the audience. And, despite the fact that, half of Americans believe in climate change, or more than half, and are concerned, only about 1 in 10 have ever taken any kind of political or civic action with regard to climate change. And so how do we get those people to move from, this is a pretty big deal, to actually doing something about it that isn't just, I'm going to recycle more?
That's a really good point, and I do want to look at messages that inspire understanding of climate change versus messages that inspire action. Anirudh, does your research show that the best way to deal with what I'm going to call the resistant audience is to just be super nice, or are there other ways that you think we should be reaching it? And part of this is because my son's mother-in-law, who lives in Tennessee, she just listens to YouTube, right? She gets up every morning, turns on YouTube, and remembers why she hates everything about climate change and liberals and everything else. So how do we reach those guys?
Yeah, so I don't think niceness is the strategy. I don't think meanness is the strategy.
Agreed.
I think recognizing that you have to be values consistent, I think that is a phrase that we heard a lot. I think that if your communications is ignorant to people's actual lived experience and their lived needs, you're going to get nowhere. So I think the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, did a great job of making things bipartisan. It did it by spending $2.50 in red districts for every dollar in a blue district. Think about that. A blue Congress and a blue president gave a massive giveaway to a bunch of red congressional districts in order to secure it from partisan attacks, right? And so we have to align with people's interests. I think if you want to talk to people about farm yields and crop yields and losing farms that they've had in their family for 5 generations, they're going to listen to you. If you want to add the word climate change to that conversation, they may stop listening. And you have to decide whether you want to use a shibboleth identity marker or whether you want to communicate.
Which is actually a question that I've been planning to ask, which is, what about communicating about climate change without ever saying climate change? Is that a tactic that we should be using? Where does it work and where does it do not?
Yeah, and so my co-author and I have done work on this very question, and we did find that particularly among Republican and conservative audiences, if you talk about clean energy policies, not as a way to address climate change, but as a way to address air pollution or as a way to address energy insecurity, it boosts support among those audiences. And so, I want to be careful not to suggest that we shouldn't use the word climate change, because I think it's really important to normalize conversation around climate change and explicitly about climate change. But I think it is reassuring and encouraging that we can get people on board with the kinds of policies we want them to support by talking about these co-benefits.
Do you agree, Bernadette?
Yes, and all of it really comes down to knowing your audience. It's what Laura was saying with her last response. The different layers of conversation, the different layers of activation. What is your ultimate goal within what you're trying to do? But the golden rule of all communication, and it is so often forgotten, is know your audience. Learn as much as you can about them. And that can play out in many different ways. But there are often things that connect you more than divide you. We focus on the divisions, but there's so much that connects us. And going to those connections is a way of bringing these policies forward, this knowledge forward, the science forward, all of it. That's how we build, that's one of the ways that we build trust and build respect. And I say this often, but so I'm a Penn State fan. We have football tickets, and people around me are not voting like I am, but we've got sports in common, and we've got that game in common, and a lot of people have things like this. So there's ways in to start conversations by connecting with people on those shared values. So yes, we do need to think about our audience, but there are ways to eventually get to the words climate change. There are eventually ways to get to what you're trying to have as an outcome, whether it's clean energy, whether it's a transportation realignment and revolution that we're going through right now, and all of those ways that we can bring down our carbon emissions. And one extra point to add to that, there's some interesting research that came out of Potential Energy Coalition late last year after the election. And it did show that with conservative leading audiences, you can engage in the word climate change. You can do it. It's how you do it.
Anirudh, you've used the term low-touch climate messaging in popular culture, such as the entertainment industry, and so I'm wondering again, as we reach what I'm going to call a resistant audience, right, what does that actually look like? If you take a film that seemed very direct, like Don't Look Up, versus sort of just more subtle messages within a television program or a movie, what does your research tell you is the most effective way to do this?
Okay, so I want to disentangle the two parts of that.
Okay.
So the low touch part and the resistant audience part. And so I sort of, because of the panels earlier today, and we've been sort of talking a lot about how trust in science is connected to identities. I think one of the sort of surprising climate movies from the last year that was not recognized as a climate movie was Twisters. No one here would think that right off the bat. And then unless you've watched it, I did a very deep dive into it. And what's interesting is, we're talking about the partisan divide in science. We're talking about how scientists don't look like the people that we're trying to get them to trust in science. Well, here's a movie in which both scientists are from Oklahoma. One of them is a swashbuckling, cowboy hat wearing, person. But more importantly, he also is supporting the small town after the attack and, running fundraisers and is values consistent and cares about small towns. He's doing that work. They're doing that work of making scientists not just seem like people from Cambridge, but from, Oklahoma. And Oklahoma went and watched that. I mean, it was sold out. And the stars of that were meteorologists. They fall in love over data. I mean, the narrative arc
As
of
we
that.
all do.
The narrative arc of that movie, I can't remember who said science should be like a discovery process, is literally the scientific process. It starts with a bad hypothesis, then they get a sort of failed experiment, then they get new data, then they update the model, then they run a prototype, and then based on that prototype, they run a large-scale intervention. It's literally how we do science. And that was a blockbuster movie that sold out in Oklahoma. I mean, that's a version of climate communications. Right?
I kind of love that.
Can I add one more thing to that? I probably know way too much about twisters, being a meteorologist, and that was really my community who did a lot of that work. So the Storm Prediction Center is located in Norman, Oklahoma, for those who don't know, in the National Severe Storms Laboratory. And talk about building trust. The producers and directors of that worked with NSSL and SPC the entire time to make sure, I mean, there was a lot that wasn't scientifically accurate, but to represent and respect an amount of that. And so by the time it came out, the Storm Prediction Center had a whole page dedicated to what was factually correct, what wasn't. They did a whole lot with the director and the producer, and they even had a red carpet event in Oklahoma City, but they also brought NOAA to the big red carpet in LA and had a big table set up for them for people to learn more about this science. So that was a way of really building trust.
Can I just add one thing there? We're a room full of communicators. That movie got slammed by climate communicators for not using the word climate change. Everything we just said, like I think it was an amazing example of climate communications, but they didn't say the word climate change. So Salon, the New York Times, I mean, just got slammed, right? And the thing is, if you'd said the word climate change, everyone in Oklahoma would have noticed.
Right.
And also the connection between tornadoes and climate change is very complex, not blockbuster ready, right? And so you would have undermined the capacity to do the other work, which is just, so us maybe as a room, not just always thinking there, is like, what does climate communications actually mean, and can we get more broad?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I tend to be a narrative science writer, so I've always believed in the Emily Dickinson, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, right? It's so, and the kind of idea of subversive education. So I want to, since we're talking about meteorologists for a minute, talk about the weather guy on TV, television meteorologist.
Or lady.
Yes, or lady, sorry. Well, guy covers everything, really, to me. So, but is that a way, are they effective communicators about climate change without saying climate change, for instance?
Yes, they
Okay.
absolutely are. So a little bit of background. I work at Climate Central. It's a nonprofit research and communication on climate change. And my background, for a little transparency here, I was an operational forecaster, mainly on television for the first half of my career, about 12 years. Then came over to Climate Central to run our program to work with TV meteorologists in really advancing this. And it's called Climate Matters. I'm one of several. I mean, the AMS, George Mason University, NASA, NOAA, all involved in this project, and Yale also. So one of the reasons this was funded as a project from the National Science Foundation was TV meteorologists are trusted communicators. They have a large and dedicated audience. And for the most part, they're scientists, or if they're not, they're at least skilled science communicators. And they're on the front lines of our changing climate and have that ability to make the connections in the moment for what's happening. So this is how this program launched about 14 years ago now. And there's a lot of testing done around this. The first Climate Matters Meteorologist with Jim Gandy in Columbia, South Carolina. And it showed that as he brought climate messages that were local, personalized, and relatable to his community in timely ways, it worked. People understood the science of it, had more questions, had more concerns. And so that's when this went and became scaled. We started expanding all of it in Spanish translation too, to work with Spanish language media in the US, and by in a third NSF grant to scale to all local journalists in the United States too. So we really view this through three ways. One, it's education. It's bringing scientists together with meteorologists in different ways and listening. We talked a lot about listening earlier. It's where are they getting caught? Where are their questions coming up? How can we help answer those questions to move them forward in their understanding and build that knowledge? The second is we create a weekly package. Any of you can sign up for it. Lots of people sign up for it, but our Climate Matters package comes out weekly on timely climate-related topics, and we have localized data when possible scientifically across the United States. So a hot day in San Francisco is very different than a hot day in Phoenix. And so you can show the trends within that. And then we package that with the latest science, social shares, a whole lot of what the reporters and journalists and meteorologists said they want to help tell these stories. And then the third is really the networking and the support. And to me, I mean, I'm definitely biased, but TV meteorologists are some of the best science communicators out there because the science of meteorology is really complicated and hard, and it's a lot of high-level physics equations, but they don't tell you that. They tell you if it's going to rain or snow or when a storm's coming or when to be warned in that way. So they're already breaking down complex issues, and they have an ability to be on the front lines of this. And so, yes, I think they're fantastic science communicators and climate communicators.
And so one of the things I've been thinking about, because I am really interested in, like, the audience that we're targeting. And I thought Lauren's point about the fact, I still debate it with myself that there are some people, but maybe we just don't target, right? We're never going to reach them. But I'm wondering if, and this is sort of embedded in the idea that we don't even say climate change, if we are too direct, if we raise issues that are too fraught, we actually generate a backlash against climate change. And I know some of the things that you've looked at, Lauren, have looked at, climate change and social justice stories, for instance, and the way that you start actually seeing resistant response from conservative audiences when you're too focused on that kind of messaging. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about avoiding backlash in climate change messaging. I find that a really interesting problem and idea.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what others have said and what we've been talking about all morning, which is knowing your audience, connecting with their values, understanding where they're coming from. A few places that we have noted backlash in the kind of messaging research that we do. One, a few years ago, the Guardian newspaper changed their reporting guidelines around climate change and said, okay, we need to call this climate emergency, we need to call this climate crisis. And so we were interested, okay, how do audiences actually react to that shift in nomenclature? And so we did an experiment looking at that. And what we found was that, along looking at most metrics of climate engagement, it didn't really matter what you called climate change. But we did find some backlash when it came to the perceived credibility of the news. And using climate emergency made people feel like the news itself was less credible and they were less interested in it. And so, that's a place that might give you pause, right? We don't want to just jump in and adopt wholesale use of new terminology. This is very recent research, so it's not published yet, but we have been looking at how to talk about climate inequities and issues of climate justice. And there's a very good portion of the American public who doesn't believe that there are unequal impacts of climate change. And so how can we get them to believe that there are climate inequities and support policies to address them? And so, we looked at messaging around focusing on race-based climate inequities versus class-based climate inequities. And somewhat unsurprisingly, when you talk about race-based cleavages, we see backlash, particularly among people who are, have stronger racial attitudes. But when you talk about class-based differences, people are more open to accepting that, oh yeah, we do have these climate disparities and we should do something about it. So again, knowing your audience, knowing where they're coming from is really key.
So, Anirudh, and taking us out of journalism, because I think that's such an important point, just for a minute, because I know some of the things you've looked at has been what you described as, I hope I'm getting this right, a social permission structure, in which you're influenced by your peers, the people around you, how they behave. And so when we're actually getting out the message of climate change, and here I kind of want to shift us into messages that encourage people to change their behaviors to some extent. I mean, it's one thing to say, yes, I have managed to persuade 54% of the Americans overall in some way or another that this is legitimate and backed by evidence. It's another thing to say, I'm going to take that message and do something with it. So could you talk a little bit about your research looking at community influences on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to jump in because this. So we, where backlash might be different, might vary on. Like, I think entertainment has a really interesting pathway in. So we ran a study on Madam Secretary, which dealt with a typhoon that hit an island, and the Secretary of State has to relocate the entire population. So you've got climate justice, climate policy, climate migration, all these like hot button issues. But it's drama. It's entertaining. It's fast paced. I sort of entered this space not from the entertainment lens, but from a persuasion perspective, and I have learned actually a lot from the creative side of like, hey, sometimes the good story is the right way, and don't mess up the story. And we saw very shocking movements on all these climate justice measures, And we did not get to run a study on this. I wish we had, but the True Detective latest season, which is just explicitly on indigenous activism and climate consequences, and just so explicit. But it's baked into the story. I would be super curious to run that. If there's funders in the room, please fund this study. But I think there's sort of how entertainment might be able to get around is just a fun question. But to return to what you actually asked, yeah, I think a lot of what we're trying to look at is how can small moments that can show up in almost any genre, in almost any context, start influencing people's perceptions of what people like them are doing and what people like them expect them to be doing. Those are your best two predictors for whether or not you adopt any action, especially climate action. It's not climate worry, it's not climate concern, it's not even political lean, weirdly enough. It's literally, what do I think my neighbors are doing, and what do I think my neighbors want me to do? That second part is the most important, right? It's not even whether I think it's the right thing to do. So we looked at a clip from the latest season of And Just Like That, the HBO show, where I'm going to get this wrong because I am not it's Miranda. Miranda orders a steak taco and then goes, you know what? I'll have a plant-based thing. And so because she switched, we were able to slice it up into 3 separate variations of a stimuli. She either orders plant-based, she orders steak, or she does the switch. Long story short, what we see is just this brief exposure, no climate mention, no nothing. It's 2 seconds of dialogue in a 3-minute clip, and people's perceptions of norms changed. Now, how long does that last? I don't know. But what I do know is that that's an important precursor to behavior adoption. Weirdly enough, people's association of plant-based diets to the environment just boosted itself. No mention needed. And I think if in that strategy, you just sort of, if it's a small touch, but you can have that small touch aggregate through everything you're watching, it's just showing up again and again and again. I do believe, and I don't have the data for this is a hypothesis, that will start aggregating. And that those aggregations will start becoming more durable. And as they become more durable, I will just have the sense that, society is moving this way. And then I move that way. So I do think that provides a very unique pathway into helping people move in the direction they already want to move. Americans already want to cut meat. This isn't propaganda. This is literally helping people move in the direction they already want to move.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And so also, Bernadette and Lauren, if we just focus on messages that move us, right? Not just awareness, but actual, I'm going to respond to this, I'm going to take an action. I've seen some indications that doom and gloom, and in science journalism, we tend to mock climate catastrophism reporting as like making us less credible. But does doom and gloom messaging actually inspire people to act? Or if not, what are the messages that your work, your experience, or your research has suggested are most effective?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to +1 everything that he said. I wrote an entire book about the role of comedy and social change and social justice. And, one of the things we say repeatedly is a single comedy message or a single TV show, listening to Stuart Goldsmith, as funny as he was, is not going to make you get out and go and you're going to join a protest or sign a petition or start becoming a vegan. But as those messages amass and aggregate, it shifts culture as a whole. And so where I think comedy and entertainment can be most influential is normalizing these behaviors and conversations about climate change. It's okay to talk about it, right? It can help sanction discussion and behavior that can move us in the direction that we want to move in. So I just want to endorse entertainment and comedy as being especially important. And then remind me what your question was.
Are there messages that you're aware, that you've studied, that you think effectively do prompt behavioral change or response to climate change challenges?
Yeah, so in the research that I have done, it is hard to move behavior. It is much easier to shift people's emotions. To shift their sense of agency. And this is what you were asking about, this kind of catastrophic messaging versus more hope-driven messaging. And that has been a central concern in my research. And sort of the broad conclusion that we draw is that you need both, right? People need to understand the problem. They need to understand how it's going to impact them, but then they need information about what to do about that problem. I mean, this goes back to, kind of basic behavior change theory, right? If you give information to people about a threat, they need information about what to do to overcome that threat. Otherwise, they're going to withdraw. And so one of the frustrating things that we have found in our research on at least journalistic coverage of climate change is that in a single story, and some of this is maybe based on space constraints in a single story, but in a single story it is very unusual that journalists cover both the impacts of climate change, the problem, and the actions, what we can do about it. And so then that means either people are getting scared without information about what they can do about it, or they're getting information about solutions without the context to appreciate the problem. And so packaging those together, I think, is really important.
That's a good point. Did you want to add to that, Bernadette?
Yes, and so there's a few things to this. First of all, the question that was posed to the public for so long is, do you believe in climate change or not? I mean, that was answered in the 1970s and 1980s and fundamentally answered with the first IPCC. So that was, I mean, even in some of the presidential elections of recent years, that was still a question being posed. So that's what people are responding to, because that's what they've been presented with for so long. And we've moved way past it. How we started this whole session is, what does that mean to you? What can you do about it? What are your plans? So the public is waking up to the issue, but in a very different framing than those of us who have spent time thinking about this. There's a huge gap in what I call a climate IQ. People know something's happening, but they don't know what, and they don't know what can be done about it. So there's still this massive gap, and it's not just lack of information. It's not the right information in the right places at the right times. That is an issue still in climate change, big time. So now as we finally get people up and running and doing things like, oh my gosh, what can we do? And people have not fully advanced with some of that knowledge, and our solutions, while some are really robust and have been around a while, like solar and wind, there's a lot that's really new. And another thing that's really interesting, specifically with journalists, when I studied a lot of this through the lens of journalism, is we're shifting from a not-for-profit to a for-profit space right now with climate, which is going to really build into a lot of our systems. However, journalists in general are hesitant to go somewhere until they trust it. So they don't want to be caught up in greenwashing. So when something's brand new and they're being pitched this new solution, technology idea, by these large volumes with companies they've never heard of, that they have no way of tracking, that there's no, are they going to be around in 6 months or not? It's hard for them to go there too. So in general, the science has come through long-standing institutions and agencies and brought in through NGOs like ours who have worked with all of these trusted institutions, whereas a lot of the solutions are coming from spaces that don't have that same grounding. And it is harder to trust. So that's part of the reason there's a gap in the solutions journalism space right now, is people want to go there, but they're overwhelmed. It's been brought up earlier just how journalism in general is being degraded and attacked as is science, as is a lot right now. But they have no capacity, and they don't have a lot of time to do that research to understand who should I trust, where should I go, what should I do.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah, so, I sort of keep doing this. I'm going to pitch expanding climate communications one more step, and which is, and out myself as a hypocrite. So I switched to solar in 2008 when it was really hard and complicated and took a whole day in Chicago. And then I moved, and I was working on getting people to switch to solar, doing the comms work, and it took me 4 months to switch my house. I then ran a study where I asked, this is the strongest climate intervention you can do. I took my nearest peers and I told them, I switched to solar, just your utility. I'm going to call you in 2 weeks and I'm going to remind you. I'm going to follow up. And then I did, and then I called them again, and I followed up again. And I mean, you can't get more intervention-y than this. And the conversion rate was 1 in 10. And that was because the rest of it was gunk. And so when we do communication, if we don't think about the rest of the pipeline, which is like, I just gave you an idea, switch to veganism, and then maybe give you a recipe and some, like a shopping list and maybe recommendations for an app, and that is part of climate communications, right? And we sort of stop at the veganism good for climate and then here's 3 apps you can use and here's some great recipes.
That's a really good point, the actual practical follow-up to these kinds of things. I have one more question I want to ask you, and then we are going to take questions from you guys, which is this. And I was thinking about it when you were talking about twisters and, the way it was seen in Oklahoma and all of the, support. Nevertheless, this does not actually protect NOAA in our current administration, and in fact, I've seen some evidence that some of the centers in Oklahoma are actually directly under threat now. So my question to you is, which goes back almost to the changing of our title, is we have learned a lot about how to be smart in communicating about climate change. We have learned a lot about how to think about how to effectively try to induce positive action. Does that still work today? Are there ways that you would share the story of climate change differently at this moment as information about climate change gets pulled out of our federal government websites, as forecasters start disappearing from the federal government? Is there anything that you would change in what you're looking at now or do?
I'll start.
Totally on the spot.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the things that I would, people sort of talk often about messaging around the scientific consensus. I would knock that off. I don't have data to back that up. That's just an intuition. But I think that we are in a war on science world, and if you keep making climate partisan, then we will keep having these kinds of swings. And so we have to make it nonpartisan. So, and we live in a electoral college that disproportionately provides power to rural areas in deciding the presidency and in deciding the Senate. So I would really focus very actively on how climate change is changing rural areas, how it is changing. Twisters does this, by the way. They have a bit in there about farm insurance in a blockbuster movie. I mean, wow. But I would talk a lot about that. I would talk a lot about the price of home insurance. Not surprisingly, the federal government pulled down the risk map on which showed the risk of your property to different extreme weather events. I think they know what they're doing. That is a very great way to communicate. Your house insurance is going to go up by 20%. Okay, I know what that means, right? So I would just make it very local, and I would disproportionately weigh rural issues because that's how our political system is designed.
Yeah, Bernadette?
I think there's a lot we're going to learn. There's no simple answer to this, but there are a lot of things that we have learned that will change and some that will likely hold true. People still love weather. There's still a lot of ways of connecting with weather. And just for a little more perspective, my office is doing a lot with attribution science. And for those who don't follow the ins and the outs of climate science, this is a way where we can go into individual weather events and quantify the role of climate change within these events. It's a field that has absolutely exploded in the last 20 years, and it's at the point now where it's what's behind a lot of the lawsuits that are happening. It's part of the loss and damage conversation globally in the UN conversations and COP. And it has been a confidence builder for climate communication. Even if people aren't going in and necessarily using the quantification, saying this storm was 10 times more likely. I've worked with journalists who have looked at that number and have felt confident to put climate in that story. And I mean, even Lester Holt on NBC, we work very closely with their climate unit, which is essentially their weather unit. And there was a tornado outbreak, and same thing, complicated science, the layers with climate change and tornadoes. However, it was an off-season, well, what are seasons anymore? It was an off-season tornado outbreak in January, and it was so warm ahead of it. And we have at Climate Center what's called the Climate Shift Index. It's free, it's open, anyone can use it, and it quantifies the role of climate change in temperatures around the globe every day. And so they were able to see the spike in temperature and the climate connection, and they led that newscast with a climate message and making that connection for the public. So weather is really a way of moving forward and making connections and helping people understand. Another thing, the next round of the Yale and George Mason Global Warming 6 America stuff is coming out shortly, or just did, but the maps are coming out soon. And still overwhelmingly, people love renewable energy. They absolutely love it across the board. And you can go into every little county around the country, and the numbers are in the 70% range. So this is an area where we still can do a lot. And think about it, for when you get into the cultural identity, when you get into these, these issues that are really anchoring people, what's more independent than I've got my own sun, I've got my own power, right? I'm disconnected from so there's a lot that can be done there. Another thing that has consistently tested high in their messages, and it's my favorite one, is they have a question about teaching the causes, consequences, and solutions of climate change. And think about all the cultural wars around teaching in our classrooms. This is a real identity issue, but it's still in the 70% range that people support this around the country. And to me, that's the biggest question that shows I know something's happening, but I don't understand what, and I need help understanding that. And so this is really listening to what people are saying in the data and their answers. So there's still a lot of ways forward with this, and quite honestly, there's a lot with this last election, but it was not a climate election, so not going to take it as a mandate that people are against it. And one last piece. The things that people did care about and vote for in the election, sadly, are all connected to climate change. And it is connecting with those pieces and helping people understand that. We do that in our Climate Matters. We have 50 packages a year we put out. So we one recently on climate change in chocolate, climate change in football, things that people care about, the economy, our health. We do a lot of climate and health. And so there's ways of really making those connections for things that we know people care about.
Like it, and take it away, Laura.
Okay, yeah. I think it, again, comes back to reaching people where they are, whether that is through weather, whether that is through entertainment, whether that is on social media. We had a question earlier about influencers. I mean, I think that is going to be hugely important. We know that young people especially are not going to seek out information on climate change. They rely on this news finds me theory where they expect anything important is going to arrive, on their social media feeds, to their text messaging or what have you. And so reaching people where they are is going to be, really fundamental. It might be in a get ready with me video on TikTok, right? Or a makeup tutorial, trying to embed, climate information there. I think it's going to be important. I think we also really need to emphasize not only how all of the impacts of climate change relate to people in various ways, whether it's the price of insurance or the cost of chocolate or what have you, but also the benefits of taking action, the various benefits of taking action. And we've already talked about today on this panel that you don't need to say climate change to get people to appreciate the benefits of renewables, for example. And so harnessing that, I think, is really valuable. And I think, as we get sort of jaded in terms of what's going on in our federal government, I think it's important to remind people that they can have a very strong voice and a strong influence at the local level. And so a lot of change starts there, and we can be really impactful locally and in our states.
Aren't they great? They're so good. And we're really almost out of time, unfortunately, right? I don't understand this clock at all, but it's almost 1 o'clock, which I think is our cutoff time.
I think they want to give you a few more minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. So are there any?
For transparency, it says 17 minutes to us up here.
So, okay, 1:10. So we do actually have at least 10 minutes for some really great questions that I know you might have, and I see hands going up. So over here.
Hi, this question's primarily for Bernadette. So I'm in LA. I was not directly impacted by the fires, but of course everyone in LA knows many people who have been. I haven't seen much local coverage, whether from local meteorologists or weather influencers talking about climate change. I was wondering if you could speak to what responsibility you believe these weather communicators have in the context of these localized disasters to talk about climate change, and should they be prioritizing talking about the fact that these events are caused to some extent by our changing climate? Should they be talking about mitigation? Should they be talking about adaptation?
So there wasn't enough locally at all. There was more nationally and internationally, but not locally. And there's a few pieces of that. Many of the meteorologists were in the immediacy of this evacuation, that evacuation, this wind's kicking up. And so it doesn't mean climate's going to come in with every message, right? But, I mean, it's not enough. But Sammy Roth, LA Times, some amazing work, right? And Allison Agson, so at USC, we have some USC people here. Yes, that's right, you are. That's sorry, forgot that connection. So Allison Agson, who's working at USC with the climate, she was doing some great work around it too, but again, it's not enough. And this is where sometimes we compound just because one message didn't break through that we're not doing it right. This is what Tony Leisowitz has said at Yale with the weather side of this, is and he's worked on us with attribution messaging too, of it's not a messaging problem when it comes to weather and attribution. Certain things may be, but it's a volume problem. There's not enough volume around it. And at a time when our media ecosystem is so fragmented and overloaded, and really I call it an information ecosystem now because so much of the online doesn't really ground itself in fact, and like news does. And so there's a lot of layers of who needs to be educated and equipped with this information and empowered with this information. And it's something we're trying to get to more people in more ways right now. But this is why events like this are so critical for us to work together, because where we're seeing the anti-climate messages work through is from people who invested and understood the investment in communication for decades consistently, and a lot of intentional disinformation. But on the other side, with the value of science, it's always these really cool projects that get a short-term grant, and it's good, but it doesn't have the capacity to scale or to connect with other good people doing this. So it's another thing we have to do when we're already overwhelmed, but working together and the power of partnerships is so critical so that we can share these learnings, so we can collectively get it out in a larger voice, because we're never going to have that kind of funding that's on the other side of these anti-climate messages. We're just not. So the power of collaboration, and why we work with people like Allison and Sammy and all these great people and all these people here and so many new faces to me here that I want to work with, is so that we can optimize our impact with those messages, because it's not enough yet.
Over here.
Hi.
Oops.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Sam. I work at a museum connecting people to phenomena discovered through science and through art. And I'm curious about the efficacy of offering action and next step, and at what scale that can work the best. Here in the panel, when we have very broad national or international blockbuster hits, it might not be appropriate to have a list of credits like, here's what you can do, here's where you can go. There's not that necessary call to action. But on the personal scale of my 10 closest friends who might trust me, I can set a roadmap of actions to take toward finding climate solutions to or mitigation to climate catastrophe. Where I'm curious is that middle ground between journalism, scales of journalism, museum, scales of museum, where it might feel most appropriate to offer people roadmaps or out as they're leaving the door, what can you do with the information that we've shared with you? Because I can see it becoming made partisan at certain scales when speaking to certain scales of audiences.
I have thoughts, but
I can start and then turn it over to you. Yeah, so I want to just point to an example around a blockbuster film. So Don't Look Up, for example, worked with Count Us In and a number of climate experts to develop a platform in conjunction with the film to do exactly what you're saying, reaching people who watched the movie and then said, oh, wow, I really want to do something about it. And they could then go to this web-based platform and find a whole variety of actions they could take that sort of met the comfort levels of different kinds of people, right? So in some cases, it's contacting an elected official. In some cases, it's, eating meat one last time a week. In other cases, it's talking to your grandparents about climate change. And so I think that's a model. I don't know if they evaluated it and saw how effective it was, but that's a model for how to do it even with blockbuster films and entertainment. I think in a museum setting, you have an audience who is engaged and wants to be engaged. And so I think it's really important to take advantage of that captive audience. And so I don't know exactly what, and there's probably informal science educators here who could speak better to it, but I think giving people information on the way out of the door, or even as part of the programming, can be really valuable. That connects to the program that they just heard. Yeah.
Either of you want to add to that?
yeah, absolutely. Those are two of the points I was going to make. So, and on top of that, communication is a solution, and by having those conversations, you're opening a door to get people to the point of even asking, what else can I do? Because there's still like a part of society that's not even asking that question. So communication is the doorway to that, and every one of us can have conversations. You can encourage people leaving to have 5 conversations over the next week. I mean, it is legitimately a solution. So that's one piece of it that everyone can do. And honestly, we talk about the individual solutions. We do need the system scales. We've waited decades, so we need it all at this point. The thing is, you get those system scales sometimes from the individuals. For example, Greta Thunberg was one person who didn't even talk, just had a sign. That was her communication, and sat there. And she created an entire movement. So it does matter, and all of it matters. And those are things you can encourage everyone to do. She's had her hand up a lot.
So I want to add, so we did evaluate that Don't Look Up
you did?
thing. Yes. So we ran a study. People watched Don't Look Up, or they watched Don't Look Up plus a video by Leo explaining the allegory and sort of what you could do about it. And, not surprisingly, you get pretty mixed results when you watch Don't Look Up. It's an allegory. It was happening during COVID, so half the people thought it was about COVID. But once you sort of paired it, you really just got like very significant boosts, right? So this video was on YouTube. You could imagine people sort of watching that. Now, as a behavioral scientist, that's a little extra friction. So I want to bring up Wild Robot. In Wild Robot, before the movie aired, there was a PSA with the lead actor sort of talking about how much she cares about the environment, and that aired in sort of, I can't remember how many, but like a large number of the markets that Wild Robot. And so now you've got a bunch of kids and families going in, someone they look up to has just talked about how much they care about the climate, open them up, and then they watch this phenomenal heart-wrenching movie, and you've just done an impact multiplier, right? So I think it's, with the entertainment stuff, it's going to be a lot about pairing it with secondary messages, these secondary campaigns, and then pairing those secondary campaigns with people who are on the ground who can help you take that action, like actually move you into action. So, yeah.
No, that's a good point. Other questions?
She's had her hand up the whole time.
Oh, sorry. I'm so pointed in this direction, sorry.
Hi.
Claire.
Hi, Deborah. Hi, I'm Claire. I'm a climate journalist. My question is about Twisters. I'm going to bring it back. In the movie Twisters, there's a scene where a tornado comes across a wind farm, topples a wind turbine. The wind turbine then topples onto the highway and almost hits a car, nearly killing some of our protagonists. Tornadoes rarely topple turbines, and they're not sited close to highways. So those are two pieces of misinformation right there. How do you view that scene? In my view, climate misinformation is a danger, but I see clean energy and misinformation rising, and I think that interacts a lot with solutions denialism as well. So I'd love to get your input on that.
Yeah, so you left off the part where that also causes a giant explosion in an oil refinery
that.
and huge flames go into the sky. And so essentially you're saying, like, why was there destruction in a blockbuster movie? Because it's a summer blockbuster movie. The goal of the summer blockbuster movie wasn't climate comms. The thing I'm trying to convince you of is there might be more kinds of climate comms than seem apparent. Yeah, I saw the wind farm thing. Could they have skipped it? Sure. There's a lot of wind farms around there. Would it have been as authentic? No. Right? And so if you're blowing up oil refineries and you're blowing up wind farms, there's a degree to which if you take entertainment and you make it less authentic and turn it into broccoli, what's going to happen is nobody's going to watch and your impact will drop to zero. So at some level, let some things blow up. The movie still had a narrative arc in which science was the hero and saved the day. Local scientists that sound like Oklahomans take care of their community, right? I mean, there's just wins. And I think here, actually, you've brought me to a thing that I like to say a lot. No single piece of content, no single movie, no single message can do everything. We are too quick as climate communicators to notice that they broke the wind farm and not notice that it also blew up an oil refinery. And we eat our own. And we got to knock it off because we eat our own. And as a result, you know what's going to happen is the next person trying to make that movie becomes a little less likely to do it. So they just stay out of the conversation.
Good point. I'm trying to look in all directions. We have time for one more question.
So online, we have a viewer who wants to know all of your books, like what you've written about. They want to be able to read them. And I want to add to that because, yes, something that's been on my mind personally throughout this day, and so I want to bring it back to maybe this climate panel, is this conversation that has been had about sort of the elephant in the room, a lot of science communicators, how do I bring more people to me, right? And now we're having this conversation about, well, how do we bring us to where the people are already consuming, this, meet people where they are. Which takes me to that statement that you sometimes hear television executives saying, like, if you give them ground beef, they're going to want ground beef, and if you give them steak, they're going to want steak. Are we responsible to some extent by leaving certain words out, by shallowing out certain messages for the movement, the political movement in one direction? Like a little bit of devil's advocate here, right? We meet people where they are, and so as not to scare them away, we water down the message. At what point are we responsible for the message becoming water? And I think that's something that we haven't really talked about much.
So let's do that first, and then, rush it, do a quick, here's my amazing books.
Yeah, then
right.
So I mean, I do not recommend watering down the message. I recommend targeting the message. Talking about how crop yields are failing and people are losing their farms is not watering down the message. It's just making the message relevant, right? So I absolutely don't believe that. There are 2 Super Bowl ads. These are people who do behavior change for a living, and they get paid on how effective they are. I encourage you to watch them. Those are the most expensive minutes on television. They're selling EVs, electric vehicles. Those are good for decarbonization. I think they threaded the needle on how to do it in the Trumpian age. You know, they talk about freedom, they talk about choice. There's weird rural adventures. It seems fun. The cars are cool. Like, behavior change is behavior change.
So to me, it's not necessarily watering down. There's a gap in the conversations that are happening in certain circles and other circles. And this is where I come to that climate IQ. For example, with our Climate Matters, when Biden got elected, I was like, pause this schedule or editorial calendar, because all of a sudden all the climate people are net zero, this. And it's language that most of society is like, what are you talking about? And so we started doing, what's a net zero? There's just this. If you ask a lot of people who are concerned about climate change and are convinced it's happening, they still don't know the causes. So sometimes it ill-equips you to give them solutions if they don't know it's greenhouse gases and where greenhouse gases come from. As some people, there's a large percentage that still thinks it's the ozone hole. So there's this big gap in some of these fundamentals. And to me, that's where it's bridging these divides versus watering down or not. It's having intelligent conversations, but bringing this information together.
Lauren.
Yeah, so, I'll answer the question about my book because it's a way of answering the second question. So I wrote a book called A Comedian and an Activist Walk Into a Bar, The Serious Role of Comedy in Social Justice. And one of the motivations for the book and one of the kind of arguments that we really foreground is disrupting this misperception that because something is funny and because something is entertaining, it is watering down, right? Or it's distracting or trivializing. But comedy, and we saw it with Stuart Goldsmith, can deliver really harsh societal truths. It can impart substantive information. It just does it in a way that's more palatable and relatable and entertaining. And what we find in our research is that experience of being entertained can really engage people in meaningful ways and push them to get involved in issues and think about issues in new and different ways.
Oh, that's such a good combined answer. Did you want to talk about a book, you guys?
I've not written any books, but you're all welcome to sign up for our Climate Matters. ClimateCentral.org is under the Climate Matters section for sign up. Again, these are weekly packages on timely climate-related issues if you're interested.
Yeah, so I have also not written a book, but you can find a bunch of our research articles and thought pieces at Rare's Entertainment Lab. I really want to stress this is not a call to water things down at all, right? Like, this is very much a call to get creative about how we can get people to care. And sometimes you have to move, it's like move the behavior and then the belief follows. You start driving the EV and now you suddenly might start caring more about carbon, right? It's not always like this linear model. Yeah.
I like it. And I will just say that I'm working on a book on female poisoners and murderers, and I think we should totally put that into solutions journalism. So, anyway, you guys were wonderful. Thank you so much.